So, I mean, there's a whole bunch I could say to something like that, but very quickly, I've been around the block. My goal right now is to solve cybersecurity governance. I am very focused on upwards management, even though I'm very strong on the downwards management capabilities. I look at culture and all kinds of things. But I have been in federal security. I have been at small companies and startups. I have been at medium-sized companies. So I've got a very broad range of experiences that I come to the table with.
Welcome to Life of a CISO. I'm Dr. Eric Cole, your host, and we'll be taking you on a journey each week on what it takes to be a CISO and what are solutions that you can implement today if you are currently a Chief Information Security Officer or if you want to be one in the future. This is Life of a CISO. Welcome, my friends. You know what time it is. It is time for Life of a CISO with yours truly. Dr. E is in the house. And as many of you have been asking, we have another amazing guest today, somebody who's very seasoned in cybersecurity, in working with corporations and being a Chief Information Security Officer. So it's great pleasure that Matthew Webster agreed to be on the show today. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
We'll get more into your background in a little bit, but I always find that people can give better bios than I can. So can you sort of give a quick, maybe 20, 30-second bio highlighting anything I might have missed just to show the audience your background credentials and where you're coming from with your advice?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch I could say to something like that, but very quickly, I've been around the block. My goal right now is to solve cybersecurity governance. I am very focused on upwards management, even though I'm very strong on the downwards management capabilities. I look at culture and all kinds of things. But I have been in federal security. I have been at small companies and startups. I have been at medium-sized companies. So I've got a very broad range of experiences that I come to the table with. So that's what I focus on, is using all of those to bring lessons from different perspectives.
Excellent. And I love it. And I would just say, go and check out his LinkedIn profile, because I think that that does a lot more justice in terms of advising executives, strategic resilience, author, cybersecurity leader. I think that sums it up really, really nice. So I always love going back and hearing people's origin stories, because I think it really sets a good background of how so many different diverse backgrounds can get into cyber. So can you sort of take us back? And I don't know if it's 5, 10, or 20 years of sort of when you first decided this was the career track, when you first sort of decided I want to be in cybersecurity. Get us in your mindset. And then what was the first job, or how did you get into this field?
So honestly, like, I was in IT, and like a lot of people in security, we're doing a lot of IT work. And yes, I dealt with Macs and PCs. And this is, almost 3 decades ago. And I took a course on it was like a 10 domains of the CISSP from SANS. And there, I think it was like a 9 or 10-day course or something like that ages ago. That course lit me on fire. It told me how much I didn't know. And I was like, wow, this is fantastic. And that just kind of said, okay, what don't I know? And so then I started working with somebody to mentor me on some of the networking stuff. So I started learning more about those types of things. I just went on fire and went off in 100 different directions, and I'm still moving along. So
I love it.
Yeah.
And that's really the name of the game, the passion, right? You gotta find something you love to do. I sort of go in and sort of take an exception, because people always go, if you find something you love to do, you never have to work a day in your life. And I think that's the worst advice on the planet, because what I say, if you find something you love to do, you don't mind working harder than anybody else for the rest of your life, because let's face it, that there's some times where it is hard, right? So going and acting like it's all going to be fun isn't the case. I always joke in and say is, you're going to work hard. You might as well do what you love when you're working hard. So let's delve a little bit more into that. So you took the 10 domains, you got excited into that. So what was sort of the first job in which you transitioned from IT to cybersecurity, and what does that look like?
Oh, that was a massive shift, but I loved it. So I was getting into federal cybersecurity. So I jumped in from, your IT guy that was generic and did some management and other things, to straight into federal cybersecurity. Now, this is before FISMA really came in for this particular organization. And for those who are not familiar with FISMA, it is the federal standard in cybersecurity. It is based on NIST 853, and each agency is going to modify it for their specific organization. But it is considered some of the toughest standards on the planet. We are doing also something called the DISA-STIGs, the Defense Information Systems Agency Secure Technical Implementation Guide. That just like, wow, I had a whole world to play with there. And I learned so much about how to do the network properly. I mean, all kinds of things. But yeah, that was a massive transition. There was a lot of stuff that I gained out of that. And that just where I jumped in. And my whole world completely changed and has changed ever since. That was a great move for me.
Awesome. Now, and I love your input on it. And this is one where I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I always love perspective. Is a lot of folks, when they're getting into commercial cybersecurity, they're sort of saying, okay, what are sort of best practices? What are standards? I do expert witness, and it always comes up and saying, okay, what is sort of minimal level of security, good security? And there's really not a lot on the commercial side. I mean, there's a lot of different opinions, but then there's the government, where you mentioned, NIST and a lot of the government regulations and DISA-STIGs and stuff, which are good standards, but they tend to, like you said, have a lot, be a little overkill. What would you recommend for somebody who is sort of trying to establish themselves in cyber, and the board or the manager saying, okay, we don't want your opinion, we sort of want some standard, but picking something that's not too complicated? How do you recommend tackling that?
So I recommend stepping stones, kind of knowing what's out there. You have to look at the regulations and things like that, because you're going into the commercial side. What does that actually mean? For most companies, like if you're going into, say, banking, that's a whole different world. You have to do things. It's yes or no. It isn't like, and the question is how. It isn't, well, should we? And there isn't a lot of debate on those kind of things. You step into the commercial world, you have to know a whole bunch of other skills that aren't transferable from a place of high compliance like NIST 853. So my recommendation is you have to pick something. You have to pick something like maybe you want to use NIST CSF, maybe SOC 2, maybe you need to follow HIPAA, though HIPAA is starting to get out of this world with a lot of the requirements that are coming into that. But it is a shock. And so you have to focus on a lot of your leadership skills. How do you communicate, your risk management, get into ROI, return on investment, if you're not familiar with the term. So those are the people the type of skills you need to focus on. And you really need to focus on your influence skills. I would say, yeah, you've got to have your technical acumen, yes, but you've got to know some other things as well, because it's all about how do you start to build bridges and connect with other people in your organization. And those are the skills you really need to focus on.
Yeah. I am such a big fan of that too, the soft skills. I give a presentation that you're not a CISO, you're a chief officer focused on information security. And let's take information security out. What does it look like to be a chief officer? Communicate, team player, all those factors. Now, big question that comes up a lot is, it's easy to say that, right? It's easy to say, okay, be a leader, be a communicator, be charismatic, be more personable. But in a lot of cases, I mean, if you're on the technical side, those weren't skills that you were really trained on or told that were important. So how do you build those over time to be able to sort of get a seat at the boardroom and be able to have that ability to communicate as effectively as executives do?
Well, you kind of led right into something that I do on a regular basis, because I both, train CISOs and things like that. So awesome. I think that's really, really important to focus on those soft skills, and they're not easy. And don't listen to the naysayers out there. I believe that every single person on planet Earth can learn soft skills. There are tons of resources. There are books that are out there. There are courses. Like I've got a whole course for that. But there's so many ways that you can do that. But even if you pick up something and pick up one skill at a time and start to learn it, focus on that. How do you influence people? Harvard Business Review has a great little book just on how do you influence. So there's just tons of resources that are out there. There's YouTube videos, there's all kinds of other things. But that's where I would say you would want to focus, is on some of those skills. Find a course that's out there. I think there's another company that's got a certification around that in the IT field. I forgot which company it is. So there's a ton of stuff and a ton of different ways of doing things, but practice those skills very early on, because it matters. Like I'm coaching a CISO right now, and he's like 3 weeks into the job, but just in an hour of coaching, he realized that he should have changed everything that he was doing.
Yeah.
It just threw everything. Like, what? You got to have a conversation. Well, did you talk to the CEO? Did you talk to some of these? And that was just revelatory. Like, wow, that's a whole new job. It's a different job description than he thought that it was. So those kind of were very exciting to me to see those kind of transformations and that eye-opening moment. Like, whoa, that's a CISO. Yes, that's a CISO. You've got to learn to communicate. Are you talking to the CEO? Are you finding out what the business direction is? What matters? And there's a lot of tools you have at your disposal. A lot of CISOs I know stay away from some of those key tools, but also I know a lot of CIOs and CTOs to stay away from some tools like the business impact analysis. A lot of people say, I am too overly obsessed with the business impact analysis. That to me is a great alignment. There are tons of tools on how do you align with the business, but that is a really good one that I think is worthy of taking the time to learn and learn to do it right. And there are other things too. Like I do think the right way to do it is not necessarily the best way to do it, but that's my own thing because that's where I like to get into financials and how do you really get into things. It's learning how to ask questions. And if you don't know how to ask the right questions, it's going to take a long time to learn. You might think, well, I know how to answer questions. Well, if you're answering yourself that, you're probably doing it wrong because I still have a lot to learn. And I've asked a lot of questions over my career. So those are some of the things that I recommend for CISOs jumping into the role for the first time.
Awesome. A lot to unpack there, but I'm smiling because I think you probably know one of my favorite phrases is smart people know the right answer. Brilliant people ask the right questions. So it's really about asking those questions and having the tools. And then the other thing I want to mention that Matt brought up, I think it's super important is everybody needs a coach. Right? Everyone needs a coach out there. And it's sort of funny because my team goes in and sort of picks who's going to be on the show. And I'm like, I want Matthew on the show. And they're like, he's a competitor with you. And I'm like, no, he's not. I'm like, do you know how many CISOs out there? And do you know that there's many different types of wine, right? Everyone's differently. So to me, I look at us as partnering because the reality is, I don't care if it's me or you. First time CISOs need a coach. And if I'm not the right one, because I have a different personality, I look at things differently than you if you like my stuff or you want something different, definitely check out Matthew's stuff. He'll share his contact info at the end. But the reality is I'm not in a competitive business. I'm in the business of helping people. So all coaches need to work together. And I would say if you're not coaching with me, coach with Matt. Right? You need a coach to help you and track you down that path. And I just want to sort of break that down a little more because you mentioned a few things that I think is really important is you sort of said having a toolbox. And I think what many people do, and I'd like your thoughts on this, is they go in and they get one of those commercial grade toolboxes and they fill it with hundreds of tools and they don't know how to use any of them. And to me, when you're starting, get a small toolbox and have 3 or 4 tools. Don't try to master everything. So I'd sort of love your opinion on that because I think we're in a world of complexity and even with AI and stuff, people are overwhelmed with data. And I think the name of the game is simplicity, but I'd sort of love your viewpoint on that.
So I've got I agree with the small toolbox, but the reality is the larger the organization, that toolbox gets more and more complex. So let's take identity reviews, a very basic security standard that needs to be done. And I believe in separation of duties and things like that in doing those. So you have IT maybe doing the implementation and you checking from a cybersecurity standpoint. Sometimes that's going to be internal audit, and there's lots of organizational considerations to take into account. But you've got to keep it simple, but make sure you're able to be thorough. Because if you don't know who's in your organization, you don't know what's going on. That toolbox for a small organization can be relatively quick and simple. It's like, well, we've got a 20-person company. We've got 30 IDs that are in there. We've got some other types of accounts on human identities and a couple other types. It's going to be fairly simple. But you go to even like a 2,000-person company, that can get complex very quickly depending on the organization because now it's living over in SaaS. You've got all these different accounts that are created by various people. You may not even be aware of where things are going. So I'm about keeping it simple, get the basics done, but now the basics keep expanding. So you take something like vulnerability management, and now we've got, CVSS scores, common vulnerability scoring system, the original. Now we have EPSS scores. You've got external attack surface management. You've got all of these different tools that now are part of the bigger ecosystem. So I do think you have to take a look at things from a risk standpoint. I mentioned a little bit about the business impact analysis first, and I think that's really critical. But you have to understand the business first, because how do you prioritize? Because there's too much going on out there. But if you can help preserve the business in the best possible way, I think that's a good thing to do. Like, I'm very big on, and I know a couple of other people have been focusing in this direction. I picked this up from a gentleman by the name of Tim Leach, but I've always done the BIA, but he focuses on mission critical objectives. And so I'm on that boat now, because you have to understand the business. That's another thing to do, where it's a little bit larger, because the business may be more than just what that business impact analysis is going to cover in some of those cases. So when you look at that, that's what I would do from a tooling perspective. What's the right level of security for the organization, and how do you prioritize? Even gigantic companies don't have the resources to do cybersecurity properly. There's too much going on, and you really need to focus on what's key for that organization. Now, compliance and things like that takes us in a different area, because sometimes it's not about that, but do things like follow the data. Do you know where that data is, or is there a data flow diagram? Is it accurately representing? Do you know if data is going over to third parties? What are they doing? So then you get into third party risk management. So the security role is getting more and more complex. And some of this is due to the way regulations are going and how things are changing. But I would advise, as much as possible, follow the data, follow the risk, and focus on things from that standpoint. Just keeping it simple. I know I can go on for an hour on this topic. Yeah. I'll just kind of end it there.
Yeah. I love that. And what I often say too is it's the communication piece, because I know a lot of executives I work with, they want Ferrari level security, but they want to pay the price of a Honda. And it's like, no, and don't overpromise, over deliver. Now, the one thing I do want to go down a little, because I know it's hard. Like when I do a lot of work over in Europe, it's a lot easier and simpler, because they have GDPR, they have AI regs. I mean, there's a lot more regulations and laws and federal data privacy and all that. And I know in the United States, to me, it's sort of struggled, because we don't have unified laws on data privacy. We have very fragmented now on AI, where different states are trying to pass, and then the White House is basically negating it. What do you recommend for like CISOs in the United States, where there's really no consistent set laws? There's some in California, New York. How do you sort of navigate that? Do you just step back and say, I'm going to follow GDPR, or do you do something a little different? What's your recommendations in this climate where the U.S. just can't seem to get their act together on federal laws?
So for me, and I've done this for many, 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 many years, is partner with legal. They're one of your key people that you can do. So like, look, so that data flow diagram, where is your data going? Who's buying into your system? What type of data? So you mentioned California, California Privacy Rights Act, that's a really key one to know. But how much data is in there? Are you following what you need to do from a privacy standpoint? So the privacy in cybersecurity, we have to work hand in hand. If we're not working hand in hand, we don't fully understand risk. Because I think one of the big things that I see with cybersecurity practitioners is we aren't connecting enough with the whole ecosystem. And that's what we have to do. We can't be successful if we're talking specifically to IT and getting a couple things done. We have to understand that larger scope of the organization in order to protect it properly. So that would be the recommendation I would have, but just connect in with everybody, find out about the data, determine what's going to be in scope, what isn't, based on the current laws. Because I know this is going to age, and probably 3 months from now, there's going to be even more changes. But keep in mind of that, because India's got a privacy requirement. Brazil has a privacy requirement. Just because the United States doesn't mean it's not applicable, but you have to understand the type of company that you're in. If you're in a global multinational, it is very applicable. Will an attorney general attack a U.S. company that's in the United States? Probably not. So there's some risk reduction there from a legal standpoint. But what if you want to expand into one of these other countries at a later point in time? You have to consider that as part of your business model. So knowing where the business model is going to be going is going to be part of understanding how do you prep the business to understand the cybersecurity context that you have to jump into. It's about building security by design.
And you're just going off, like you said, Attorney General, who they're going after. I think last year was sort of a very interesting year where we saw a few cases. I think like Uber was one of them, where there was sort of the breach and the ransomware, and they sort of went after the CISO. Fortunately, smarter minds prevailed and they dropped the charges, which I believe was the right thing to do. But I mean, it could be a scary place now. I have a lot of folks saying, do I really want to be a CISO because of the liability. And I always sort of go in and say, well, there's two types of CISOs. There's by title and true corporate officers. And you sort of need to make sure you know the difference. And just curious if you can comment on sort of as a CISO, we don't really think about it, but how can you protect yourselves and make sure that if there's an attack or ransomware or things like that, there's not liability where they can pierce the corporate veil and come after you?
So that's something that's really challenging when you're starting to look at those. And, I think you kind of alluded to Tim Brown and Joe Sullivan, who have been dealing with these types of incidents. If you're not familiar with them, for other people that are out there, read up on those cases, take a look at it. I do case studies talking about both of them. They're really interesting cases. But the reality is, you have to look at what's going on. Because the other thing that I see happening, and I've got somebody who wants to pull me in to go have this discussion. A lot of times this people want people that are just going to go along with what they're going to say. And a lot of which gets in the way of the narrative that oftentimes the technical team, especially if you're reporting into a technical function, it ends up being very problematic. And being honest and speaking up can be used against you. Now, you have to be very honest and make sure you get your ducks in a row before you speak up. You don't want to just speak off the top of your head, especially if you're talking about something very serious. But it's a big issue because a lot of times they're going to get the people who are likable, not the people who are going to challenge the status quo. And it depends on the type of organization. So some organizations, you don't need to worry about this so much. It can still matter. Like I'm aware of one CISO that had, he was in the 3 lines model. It could have been 3 lines defense, but he was part of the second line dealing with risk and reporting into internal audit. But still, he had a lot of problems with IT because there's a report out there that IT didn't want the whole business to understand. They got the report. That just created a lot of negativity that's out there. So this is a natural sort of tension. Another organization I was talking to, they said their entire teams started devolving as a result of just the GRC program, governance, risk, and compliance, for those who are not familiar with it. So some of it could be the KPIs and the metrics and things like that. So you've got to take a look at this larger understanding, the larger corporate context when you're looking at how do you protect yourself. The question is, can you be honest? If you can't, there's a problem. I've had my head cut off because I were reporting KPIs out of a tool. For those who are not familiar, key performance indicators. And those to me are the very minimal you can do from a governance standpoint to say, where are we at? So I think, and there's a lot to be said about the evolution of that and all kinds of things. But I think that you have to understand that the company needs transparency and that people need transparency. You don't have good transparency, you don't have good governance. And a lot of that means, how do you translate that to a business friendly term? What are the ROI? What's the cost benefit analysis? Are you actually putting this into financial terms that an executive or a board or director is going to buy into? Now, a lot of this is going to depend on the people that you're dealing with. But you've got to understand the corporate structure that you're working with. You have to understand the personalities of each individual person and know how to handle them and how to manage them and show that you're on their side. Like, I'm here to protect revenue. Here are the ways that I protect revenue as a CISO. But how are you being paid?
Yeah.
What? You've got to show that you're on their side. It's like, I'm here to protect you. Let me show you how I can. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to show security properly, because more often than not, if security is considered a sub-function of IT, you're just out geeking things and you're put off into a corner. So learning how do you get beyond the jargon? If you talk CVSS scores versus EPSS scores to a CEO, you've lost the game. So that's what I mean. There's a lot of things that you have to do for getting yourself protected, because it's about learning multiple languages. You talk to the IT team, depending on the IT team, they may or may not understand. Usually they do now, but sometimes you're going to find people like, okay, let's go into this a little bit more detail and make sure that you get that alignment. So you're making sure you have the business alignment, making sure you have the IT alignment, making sure that you've got numbers behind everything. That is very important. And so those are some of the factors that I would take into account.
Yeah. I think that spot on is, I'm always a big fan, and I tell CISOs is, if you can observe a meeting before you present at it, like being in a board of directors meetings, because they speak a different language. I mean, they act differently, they behave. And a lot of times they're walking in and have no clue how it's operating and functioning. So I think that's important. Also want to bring up what you said earlier, which I think is really, really important, is you got to have an ally. and legal is probably one of your best allies. Like you should never be going in and presenting information and you have no out. Like you got to have somebody in your corner that's going to back you on that front. And then I love your thoughts on this because I always sort of what's like the most important thing in Q1 in 2026 for a CISO to be successful. And what I always tell folks, and like I said, I love having smart people. So agree, disagree, counter it. But what I say the most important thing is to meet with each of the chief officers at least twice a month, one-on-one. Like even if it's a 10 or 15 minute meeting, if you're not having conversations with CEO, COO, CFO, and chief legal counsel, you're not having a communication path that you need. You should have relationships built with all of them. And I think that's the piece that many CISOs ignore is the communication and just that political side.
I 100% agree, especially when you're dealing with different types of toxicity. I deal with things like the dark triad and how do you handle them? Because and for those who are not familiar with the dark triad, this is a term that psychologists came up with in 2002 to describe the sort of confluence of dark personality traits. This would be the narcissism, psychopathy, so somebody who's a psychopath, and a Machiavellianism. And so that would be, somebody who's doing very malignant, awful things. And there's a whole cycle that you have to understand and how you're going to be undermined. But if you don't have, like, I totally agree with you. You need your allies. You need to check on your allies on a regular basis. It's okay if you're going to have detractors. You're going to find those. And I agree with you on legal, but, I would actually argue the CFO should be a key one. Are you talking value at risk? Are you talking about some of those things? You can have that with the chief revenue officer too. But you also have to understand that corporate structure and what does a CISO actually mean as well. Because there are CISOs that are divisional CISOs. Like I applied for a job once and it's like, oh no, we didn't want somebody who's actually a real CISO. We want somebody who's an architect.
What a fake CISO.
What? But you've got to understand those things. So to me, even evaluating the company before going in and finding out what are those red flags and what are the green flags and try to do a assessment of that, that's going to be an important part of it too. So even when you're starting out, you're trying to get into that CISO role, understanding that is very, very critical. You've got to ask the right questions and understand that context. And even if you respect an individual person, which is good, you want to respect the people you're reporting into, that may not be enough. They may or may not be secure in their position. So you've got to factor in all of these things and create the right alliances across the board to make sure that you're going to be successful.
And it's one of those where I always sort of say all CISOs are not created equally. And if you're going to take a job or if you're currently a CISO, evaluate what CISO you really are. To me, I sort of put it into three categories, which is you have CISOs, which are really technical engineers, but the company wants somebody with a CISO, but you're not really a CISO. The second one is more of a manager. Like you're really just managing people, but you're not really a chief officer. And then there's, of course, the chief officers that sit in the corporate office, sit with the other chief officers, attend all the board meetings. And to me, it's not a right or wrong. You just need to understand which one you're at. Because I think where people get frustrated is they want to be, say, a true chief officer, and they take a CISO position where they're buried under the CIO and it's really technical and they get frustrated. So I think it's asking enough questions during the interview to really understand which CISO you are. And I guess any other tips or tricks for navigating that? Because I think that's something that really trips people up a lot going, well, I have the CISO title, but we all know the CISO title can mean a lot or mean a little.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it boils down to understanding everybody's pain. Because you need to understand where they're at. How long have they been dealing with it? What are they? And so if you understand the pain, you can start to work towards getting them on your side. And a lot of this just has basic personality issues. Are you speaking their language? I'm going to talk about things like matching and mirroring. So, if somebody's coming in there and they're like a very loud voice like this, and you come up, well, they're going to walk all over you.
Yeah.
But if somebody's coming up very meek and you're loud, that's going to be a problem too. So you've got to understand where people are at. What are they doing? What are the different challenges that are out there? And really start to get them down the road. Because part of it is, how do you get them from point A to point B? Because part of your role as a CISO is about being a chief education officer. Because your world is geeky. It's full of all kinds of crazy stuff. And how do you translate all of this geeky stuff into something that makes sense to the average person? There are books out there like one, I have not read it, but I've heard good things about it, like the mom test.
Yeah.
But there it's like, can your mother understand it? If your mother can understand it, you're probably good to go. Just don't use all this jargon and things like that in order to create the right levels of communication.
Spot on. That's something I learned the hard way, because I used to do I still do a lot of keynotes. And like keynotes is energy, excitement, jumping around, and people would be like, oh, you got to present to our boards. And I go into these boards with some of these big companies, they're 50, 60, 65. And I come in screaming, and they're like, this guy's on drugs. Get him out of here. And I actually had to tone it down and just, be much more deliberate in what I say and calmer, because you're right. You could be the smartest person in the world, but if you're going to scare people away or shut them down, they're not going to listen to you or adhere to you. So you're very, very well said. And I love reading too, actually, just for the readers. And if you haven't read it yet, Principles by Ray Dalio.
Well, I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
It's amazing. So he basically, and I can resonate because he grew up on Long Island, lower middle class. And then he built one of the biggest investment firms, Bridgewater, on the planet. And it was all about it's exactly what we're talking about here, which is having principles and way to operate. And it reminded me, because a lot of the things you're saying are a lot of the principles he emphasizes. So that's also another really good book. This is one of those things, we always run out of time. Hopefully you'd be willing to come back, because this was super informative. But before we go, I want to make sure you have a chance. Where can people find you? How can they get in contact with you? And then any last words of wisdom that you want to share with the audience?
Sure. In terms of contacting me, I'm very active on LinkedIn, so find me there. I'm all over the place. So is
it just Matthew? How do they find you? Is it just Matthew Webster? How do they find you on LinkedIn?
Matthew Webster. You'll find it. If you even go to Google, you're going to find different aspects. I've got a podcast. I've got some
awesome. I want to make sure they find you.
Good things that are out there, but also by email, matthew.webster@cyvergence.biz. Cyvergence is the company that I founded, where I'm focusing on helping CISOs. But those are some key ways that you can get hold of me.
Awesome. And then you shared a ton of knowledge, but I always like my guests to have the last word. Any final thoughts you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I've said a lot of the key wisdom. There's so much, though. It's like, how can you really be the translator is what you really need to do. It's really key. And just I'm going to repeat this, stay away from jargon when talking to the CEO. Talk ROI, talk, cost benefit analysis, those types of things. That's how you're going to be starting to move the needle, especially with the board, because most boards don't include IT professionals or cybersecurity professionals. So you are really speaking another language. You have to understand that.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. It was a pleasure to have you. Please hang on for a second when I end the recording, but thanks everyone for joining us. Please join us next week. And like I said, you can't have enough experts in your corner. So please check out Matthew's LinkedIn profile, the great resources he has, and we'll see you next week on Life of a CISO.